So the American Revolution was over. The Constitution was written. You'd think the hard part was done, right? Well, not even close. That was just the blueprint. What came next, in the 1790s, was the real beginning, the first major stress test for this brand new idea of a government.
And that was the real question hanging over everything. I mean, it's one thing to have a rule book, a constitution on a piece of paper, but could it actually survive bitter political fights, an armed rebellion, and an election so chaotic it almost broke the country before it even got going? Let's dive in. You know, the first cracks in this new foundation didn't come from some foreign enemy. Nope. They started right inside the president's own inner circle. President George Washington, he tried to build what you might call a team of rivals. He brought in Alexander Hamilton to run the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson to be his Secretary of State. And as you can see from these fantastic notes from R.J. and J.R. Viscera, he picked two of the most brilliant guys in the country, but they had completely different ideas about what that country should actually be. So this is the really crucial point. The biggest political debates of the time weren't just abstract ideas. They were a direct personal conflict between these two guys. This wasn't just about policy, it was a full-on battle for the soul of America. And this slide just lays out their two opposing visions perfectly. On one side, you have Hamilton and the Federalists. They believed the only way to succeed was with a strong central government that could unite everybody and build a powerful nation driven by business and finance. But on the other side, you had Jefferson and his Democratic Republicans. They were terrified that a powerful central government would just stomp on people's liberty. They wanted power to stay with the states, and they imagined a future of independent farmers. I mean, these two visions were just completely at odds with each other.
And it didn't take long for these big ideas about government power to face a very real and very violent test. This was really the fundamental question. The new Constitution said the federal government could tax people. But what would happen if a bunch of citizens just looked at that law and said no?
So here's what happened. Hamilton's big financial plan had a tax on whiskey, which really hit farmers in the West hard. For them, turning grain into whiskey was the best way to get it to market. So they refused to pay. They even attacked the tax collectors. But President Washington's response? It was swift and it was powerful. He didn't just write a stern letter. He personally led an army of 13,000 soldiers into Pennsylvania to shut the rebellion down.
And this is the bottom line. The rebellion just fell apart. Not a single shot was fired. But the message was crystal clear. This new federal government was not the weak, flimsy thing that came before the Constitution. It had real power, and it wasn't afraid to use it. The first test was passed.
But just as the government was proving its strength, its most unifying leader, George Washington, decided to step away. And when he left, he gave the country a warning that was honestly pretty chilling. After 2 terms, Washington said, "That's it for me." He wasn't going to run again. But before he left, he wrote a message to the American people. And these notes here, again from R.J. and J.R. Viscera, really highlight his deep worry about the growing fight between Republicans and Federalists that he was seeing up close. He saw this spirit of party, as he called it, as a fire that could literally burn the country down. He was convinced that if people became more loyal to their political party than to the nation as a whole, it would just paralyze the government and end in disaster. He was watching the whole Hamilton versus Jefferson feud and basically begging the country not to go down that same road. So his whole farewell address really boiled down to 2 huge pieces of advice. First, do not let political parties tear the country apart. And second, don't get tangled up in permanent alliances with other countries. He saw those 2 things as the biggest threats to the future of the United States. Well, almost immediately after Washington walked out the door, the country completely ignored his first warning. And that led directly to the next major crisis, this time under President John Adams. With John Adams, a Federalist, in the top job, his party decided to tighten its grip on power. They were getting hammered in the press by the Democratic Republicans, so they passed these laws called the Alien and Sedition Acts, claiming they were all about national security. And this gets us to the Sedition Act, which was basically a direct attack on free speech. It essentially made it a crime to publish anything false, scandalous, and malicious against the president or the government. In other words, you could be arrested for criticizing them. As these notes from R.J. and J.R. Viscera lay out, the laws went after immigrants who mostly voted Democratic-Republican, making it way harder to become a citizen. But the real goal was pretty obvious.
The Sedition Act was used to arrest and silence newspaper editors and politicians from the other party. Everything Washington had warned about was coming true. So all this conflict, this bitterness, the fight over the economy, the Whiskey Rebellion, the Sedition Act, it all came to a head in the election of 1800. And let me tell you, this was probably the most chaotic and dangerous election in American history. All right, just look at this chart. The Democratic Republicans won. John Adams lost. But look closer. Their candidate for president, Thomas Jefferson, and their candidate for vice president, Aaron Burr, got the exact same number of electoral votes, 73. And the Constitution didn't have a plan for this. So who is the president? So the whole mess gets dumped into the lap of the House of Representatives. And here is the ultimate irony. The Federalist Party, the guys who had just lost the election, now got to choose the next president from their two biggest rivals, Jefferson or Burr. The House was deadlocked. They voted 35 times and still no winner. A lot of Federalists were leaning toward Burr, thinking he'd be easier to control. But then came the big twist. Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's greatest enemy, stepped in. He told his fellow Federalists to vote for Jefferson. He couldn't stand Jefferson's politics, but he believed Jefferson had principles. Burr, on the other hand, Hamilton saw as a man with no principles at all, which made him way more dangerous to the country. And this is the most important part of the whole story. After all the bitterness, all the threats, all the chaos, power changed hands. Peacefully. For the first time in modern history, a ruling party gave up control just because they lost an election. It was messy and incredibly tense, but the system held. This test review sheet from RJ and JR Vicasera just sums it up perfectly. The Whiskey Rebellion proved the government had real power. The nasty political fights ended up creating the two-party system. And the election of 1800 proved that power could be transferred without a civil war. The foundation was finally set.
And, the funny thing is, those arguments between Hamilton and Jefferson about how much power the government should have, about the economy, about the character of the nation, they never really stopped. They've just changed shape over the years. Which leaves us with a pretty big question. A system that was built to handle all that intense pressure back in the 1790s, how well is it enduring its tests today?